Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well. What is the Laffer curve and why is it significant that ignoring the logic of this simple yet effective fiscal diagram catastrophic for governments and the people? The Laffer curve was actually sketched out by somebody called Arthur Laffer in 1974, I believe. And in this diagram, he detailed how the rising tax burden on people eventually passes a point where it is counterproductive and less taxes are ultimately collected. For example, if the tax rate were 100% and you went out to work and at the end of the day all your salary was taken in tax, you would not go to work and the government would collect zero taxes. At the other end of the scale, if the tax rate were zero, no matter how much money you earned, the government would not collect anything. Now, this is purely based on income-based taxation, not consumer spending taxation such as VAT, which is different. So as the tax rate begins to fall from 100% to 98, 97, 95, eventually it gets to a point where people begin to think to themselves, I might as well work because I get to keep some of it. And the tax collected increases. As the tax rate moves from 0 to 1%, 2%, 3%, the same thing happens because they are beginning to tax a certain amount on salaries. They've moved away from 0, then obviously the tax revenue collected increases. However, as the burden of tax rate or the burden of the increasing tax rate begins to affect people more and more, it reaches a point which is the peak, which is called the point of equilibrium, which is the highest ratio of tax the government could potentially raise before it begins to fall by either overtaxing people and therefore people work less, or they blatantly evade tax. And if it is swinging back towards lower taxation, the government is literally missing the peak and not collecting as much revenue as it could. Now, on this diagram, you will see 2 points, point B and point C, where the tax revenue collected is the same. And traditionally, the point to the right, which is the same amount of tax collected on the higher end of the scale, is normally the case with governments that lean more towards socialism and higher taxation. And the point to the left on the lower taxation side is where normally conservative or right-wing or capitalist governments, whatever your choice of words, are working in with an economy that has lower taxation and more activity. Now, even though the figures collected from those two may be the same, the figure to the right is far, far worse than the figure to the left, because when you are in the territory of the figure to the right, there is far less economic activity. And in the modern day, where the increasing amount of revenue a government collects is from consumer spending tax, i.e. VAT, that begins to fall when there is less and less and less activity, and less activity equals less growth. So the key is to actually stay on the left hand or the lower side of the equilibrium, and this government has most certainly passed that point, which is unexpected from a conservative government. They have literally become top heavy, too greedy, Taxes are too high and they are literally killing the incentive of people to actually go out and work more and make more money. And if you look at the trajectory of the lines, once you pass that equilibrium, it can get to a point where revenues collected can nosedive. And by that point, governments have committed themselves to so many expenses and so many outgoings, so much red tape, such big government, that it is almost impossible, without causing economic catastrophe, for them to reverse and move to the left-hand side of the equilibrium. And I believe that it's possible that this government has actually done that already. Unfortunately, they all let greed get the better of them. They all sell out to bigger government. The civil service is always pushing for bigger government because they only care about their own positions and consolidating their positions. So any incentive to shrink the size of government is always met with fierce resistance from the civil service, who will invariably undermine the government to ensure that none of their colleagues are dismissed. This is so simple, but yet so true. And it does apply to other areas. For example, when George Osborne raised the maximum rate of stamp duty to 12% for properties of 1.5 million or more, then added a 3% surcharge for properties that were not your primary home, then added an additional 2% surcharge for overseas investors, that totals as much as 17% for overseas investors to invest in property in the UK. And whilst I disagree with overseas investors using property, not just in London, but throughout the country, as car parks for their ill-gotten gains, there could have been much more constructive way of dealing with that, because they could have introduced measures which prevent them from simply parking their money, but encourage them to invest their money into developing property, renovating property, building homes, which would have been available to the British public at no cost to the government. It would have brought in revenue, it would have brought in returns for overseas investors, and it would have encouraged yet more investment. The logic, or rather the lack of logic, in anything to do with financing of this government is literally beyond belief. And they have literally taken an economy that was in very, very good shape, and in no time they have completely destroyed it. And at this point, we haven't even felt the full effects of 14 interest rate rises, one after another. They've only just begun to filter through. So we have many months of more and more impact from these ridiculous and unjustified rate rises to come. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, as always, get in touch. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye for now.